The main protagonists in this were the employees of the company DynCorp, and the United States, because it got so many different police forces, I don't begin to understand. You cannot be a serving police officer and work for the UN if you're an American. You have to go through the contract, the private contract, which for the United States is DynCorp. So they have a contract to provide the police in this context, and some of the support staff, the logistical people, etc. So they were the ones who were providing the contingents for Bosnia, the American contingent. Now, they don't act, because you can't be a serving police officer, they need to attract people. So if you wanted to serve, you either had to resign as a police officer, with no guarantee you get a job back, so it's taking a bit of a risk, or you had to be a retired police officer, or you had to be someone who, as in the case of Dennis Ledusa, had committed offences and was actually being processed in Orange County for the crimes he committed. So he wanted quickly to nip out and come over to Bosnia, became the deputy commander, can you believe it? And you can even recruit, because the UN doesn't scrutinise, there were supermarket security guards. And they're over there to actually police the local police into how to be good police. So the quality wasn't there. Absolutely wasn't there. I mean, Kathryn Bolkovac was someone who was a very, very good cop, and she was absolutely appalled by the quality of her co-people. They didn't even have regular uniforms. You know, so wear something blue pants, blue shirt, doesn't matter what exactly it is. You know, she was appalled by that. And then you have the other contingents who are provided for by the states. And some of those states are quite good, and some of the states are not so good. And there were certain contingents where there are regularly problems as to the levels of corruption and involvement in just this sort of activity. So that's the scene, that's the scenario. And part of the problem is that they're not screened by the UN before they go in. There's no vetting process, so we can get anybody. Then you arrive in a country which doesn't have any of this rule of law, doesn't have any sort of way in which that conduct can be regulated by the domicile population, and you have a situation where you've all got some form of diplomatic immunity under the status of forces agreements. That means with your private contractor or your UN or diplomat. So basically, 24 hours a day, you are protected against whatever you might do. So even if you commit a crime which is as horrific as the crimes were being committed, if the local police, for whatever reason, did pick you up, and at the later stage they were picking people up, within seconds your contingent commander was down, getting you out and saying you have immunity. And unless that contingent commander was serious about doing trafficking and therefore put you on the list and sent you home and had you prosecuted, which never happened.
Not ever?
Not ever.
There's been two recent prosecutions.
Now, yes, now they have.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, they're starting, although we'll see if that happens. And one of the reasons they can do that is because of the legal changes which have happened in relation to the European court cases, the European countries, because of a particular case which allows now for extraterritorial jurisdiction for human rights violations, which is fabulous. Because now you've got to behave, even if you've got immunity, you've got to behave. But going back to what I was saying, that means there are no controls, not necessarily good people, not necessarily well-trained people, no discipline, and then you have the peer group pressure. I got very friendly with a Pakistani officer in the police, and he said when he was picked up from the plane by his contingent, before they were even taken to their barracks where they were going to be staying, they were shown where they went on a Saturday night, and it was made quite clear that everybody went there, because if you didn't go there, you were not part of the lads. You were letting the team down. And he didn't, and he had all sorts of problems. I mean, lucky for him, he was 6 foot tall and a black belt in martial arts, because it was physically intimidating. And then I heard from other guys that if they wanted to, even if they weren't participating, if they said anything, it was made clear to them that their career advancement was over, they'd be ostracized. Then there's another issue which I think is important, and this is a Norwegian guy said to me, never underestimate the power of the male for cognitive dissonance. We can justify anything to ourselves. One of them is, if I'm doing it, it's better I'm doing it because at least I'm nice and I'm clean. I'm not HIV positive, so it's better that it's me than anybody else. Right the way through to, they're just whores anyway, so it doesn't matter. So, you know, there was always this splendid art of self-justification at some point. And those who didn't do it, there was the blind eye turned by those who shouldn't have turned a blind eye. And this is, I think, the tragedy of it really, is there were so many good men who did nothing. There were some very good men who did try to do an awful lot, but they were in a minority, and all of them did have problems. From physical intimidation to, I mean, serious threats in the case of one Argentinian guy who was breaking the stories.
And so was this the threats and intimidation and pressure coming from peers or also from superiors or institutions?
From peers, very definitely from peers, and allowed by the institutions. I mean, this is the thing, I keep coming back to the fact it's leadership. If you have good, strong leadership who said this is not acceptable for so many different reasons, one, it's illegal, it's immoral, and it's going to lead to mission failure, because in fact it did, because one of the most, I think one of the most detrimental impacts this had was on the economy of Bosnia, because hundreds of millions of dollars went into the illegal economy in Bosnia instead of into the formal economy, which meant if you wanted to have any sort of job in Bosnia, it had to be linked to organized crime in some way. So it's not taxed, you don't get employment, you don't, your proper employment contracts, and the consequences go on and on and on. And then you've got money laundering. Go to Bosnia now, it's got the most fantastic shopping malls, with lots of people drinking coffee because they can't afford the shops. But the point is, that is money that is being turned over and cleansed, and the guys make 30 million every time they do it.
What's gone wrong? Why does the UN fail?
I think there's so many different answers to this. And I'm not sure which one is right. The one thing I think is very present, and that is the mentality of the leaders who go into the countries. I've heard so many special representatives of the Secretary General come up with the boys will be boys argument, the I will not dictate for morality argument. It's not just the guy from Bosnia. I mean, just about all of them have said that over periods of time. And with that sort of mentality, it's basically, well, if you do that, I'm going to look the other way because I've got other more important things to do. So there's that, and that's huge. Then you have the institution itself that can't be seen to not back its representatives in the field. I mean, they are the representatives of the Secretary General. So he's not going to publicly reprimand them for having adopted that attitude. So basically, it then becomes part of the institution that we don't deal with that. What we'll do is we'll let the gender advisor, who is usually on her own at a very low level, and because she's a woman, bound to be a woman, she's going to have to deal with this. Why is trafficking a woman's issue? It's not. It's all of our issues. But because whenever I do an anecdote, again, every time I went to one of these big international meetings on trafficking, it was 99% women, unless it was the police element, in which case it was 99% men. And they had an entirely different approach. It was very highly gendered, which we can discuss afterwards. But I think there is this culture, particularly within the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. It is the military part of the United Nations, so it does have this military identity. It's lots of men in uniform. It's not that many women. They do see themselves as being the warriors going in to occupy and to protect. They do have a very, I'm going to refer to it then, this sort of the culture of the hegemonic masculinity kicks in, whereby there are certain privileges which go along with all of this, and they don't want it to stop. Because it's actually quite nice to be seen as this sort of big macho warrior. It's the stereotype we have created for the military. And the other thing to remember is that you don't go in to become a peacekeeper, you go in because you're military. You have been trained to be a warrior. And we had this conversation before about, have any of you seen Full Metal Jacket? I mean, it's old now, but it's quite a terrifying film because it shows how in the Vietnam War, that in order to get a competent warrior to go off, you have to destroy that person's empathy. And if you don't really deconstruct that individual and put them back as this absolutely gendered stereotype of a warrior, it's not going to work. So if you take that, you take these people who've had that sort of training because they're trained to go off and be fighters and stick them into a different role altogether, how are they going to make that change when they've already been, that part of them, that empathy part, has been stripped away? And in the context of a peacekeeping situation, they're not really fighting anybody. They've got no one to take it out on. They're bored, they've got money. they are the occupying force. There is a huge element of superiority that goes on when you have those situations, and women are there to be used. And it just creates this environment, which is self-perpetuating, unfortunately.
If you see The Whistleblower, you'll also come away feeling sick to your stomach about the UN. And are there either branches or individuals in the UN who care more about that, about the, the result and the image and the destruction of the reputation of the UN because of what's happening, and therefore want to, not stand by all of these men who are in the field representing them and stand up and say, no, this isn't what you're supposed to do? Or are they so, are there so few of them? Or are they not powerful enough? Or are they just shut down from the get-go?
I think it's interesting. There is, I hope, a bit of a change. And I know if this film had not been made, we wouldn't even be having this conversation about there being change. Because there's been too many people on the periphery saying the same things. You've got to change, and it hasn't happened. Now they're frightening them into changing. And from the UN perspective, the UN, there's a part on this clip, and it's not in the clip, but at the meeting, Prince Saeed of Jordan, he's their permanent representative now, he was the special representative on trafficking. And he said, the problem we have is the member states. Because we say we want accountability, we want you to behave, and yet when it comes to a discussion on extraterritorial application of law, I will be instructed to go upstairs and vote against it. Because we don't want to be held accountable publicly. It's the hypocrisy of the member states which is the problem. And I think we do have to bear that in mind, that whatever Ban Ki-moon wants to do, he has to get the support of the member states. The UN is the member states. So if they won't play, he can only do what he can do within the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Now, I think that this film has forced a change in the way, at least, that they are attempting to position themselves. Yes, they were extraordinarily bland on the panel. Everybody read from the prepared script, yes, we're doing this, yes, we're always very conservative, we're not the same UN now, we have changed. Not true. We know from Haiti, DRC, no, it goes on everywhere, sorry. You haven't changed, and you've got to try harder. I think that the breakthrough is going to come when they actually do implement what some of us have been advocating for a long time. And in fact, what some of them on the panel said to me afterwards is that they're saying, if the states send us rubbish, and that was a direct quote, what can we do? What can we do with them? We need to have the warm bodies on the floor. And I'm saying, no, you don't. And this is, we don't, if you're not good at your job, if you're not professional, if you're not competent, you don't get to go. Because you're causing more problems than not having any peacekeepers. And I also think that, if there were insistence by the United Nations on exactly the standards of people they want, and insistence on the accountability mechanisms that are in place in the sending state, with full transparency and full reporting obligations to the UN, and we see who it is that's being prosecuted and then, we hope, locked up if it's been found that they have committed offences, it will really make a sea change in conduct. We're not there yet, and I think Ban Ki-moon is sort of dithering. I've been told that he personally wants it dealt with, but he's a political animal, so he's going to see how far he's going to get the backing of the member states. And this is where we all kick in, because if everybody who sees the film demands that there be changes by their member state towards the UN saying, we want you to be accountable, and we will be held accountable as well. I mean, there's a law a bill from 2010 on extraterritorial jurisdiction, which has been held up in Congress. Get that passed. Get that passed, and then your law for enforcement can actually get the Americans that commit offences here. And if everybody did that, there would be a sea change, and then that's the legal bit. And I think the legal bit tends to be almost like in the avant-garde, the vanguard of change. And when people say, actually, that's how we should be controlling ourselves, of course, then it will start kicking in. It'll take a long time, but I think that culture has got to shift. And this film did a fantastic job in, I think, making people absolutely upset, angry, and determined to do something about it. We showed the film to some of the diplomatic missions in Geneva, and I'd seen the film 13 times by then. I came in to just talk to them at the end. I've never seen so many diplomats with absolutely nothing to say because they couldn't speak. It is about the market. If there's a demand, there will be a supply, and traffickers, entrepreneurs will find ways of actually, making sure that that supply is met, that demand is met with a supply of whomever it's going to be. The situation has deteriorated enormously since the global financial crisis. It's intensified where there are particular types of free trade zones, as we've seen in Mexico and elsewhere. It's intensified where there are drilling and mining going on. So there are very obvious places and locations where it is likely to happen.
Well, that's still international capital.
Yes, but watch where the international capital, look, watch where the capital is. I mean, that's huge. And where there is a need for migration and for remunerations to go back. We have to go back to the woman and what's happening with them and why they're moving. And that will explain an awful lot. We haven't really gone into that in any detail, but it's crucially important. And the other thing to look at, and this is, again, we haven't gone into it in great depth, is the responses there are. The reason why we've been absolutely ineffectual in dealing with trafficking in conflict, but also in non-conflict, is that we seem to be in the stereotyped idea of those who deal with it from a migration perspective, those who deal with it from a law enforcement perspective, and those who just want to talk about prostitution. And it doesn't work, because those three things are going off like that because they're followed by different interest groups. And the women don't fall into any of those categories. At some point, they may want to be a migrant. They may constantly want to be a migrant, but they want to be a successful migrant. At some point, they may want to be a prostitute, but they want to be paid for it. They don't want to be sexually exploited and raped. And at some point, they may want to collude with law enforcement in order to have effective prosecution, but maybe not. And then what happens if you don't collude with the law enforcement, then you don't get status as traffic victim. So you then get handed back to the trafficker as part of your migration experience, which then is appalling. So you don't get to send your remittance and you're a failure. And so then what you have to do is you have to start playing the game. So this is why it's important to see what the women are doing in order to survive, basically. So you can't just do one approach or another. So if we take the example of what we did in Bosnia and what is translatable, if you prioritize listening to what women have told you, and then you do your legal analysis around that, and then your institutional responses around those laws, you will, for example, find that women, when they first are taken from a bar, or if say they did a raid on the Cougars on Thursday night, most of the women that we picked up would say not trafficked, not a prostitute, not underage, and then provide documentation which will show that they're not underage, most of which will be false. That would be my guess. Or because some of them may be illegal migrants, some of them may not be. But you're not going to have the real story because they don't know which way law enforcement's going to jump. Is law enforcement going to jump on them and deport them? Is law enforcement going to prosecute them? They don't know, and they'll have been told not to trust law enforcement in any case. And in many of our own cases, we wouldn't trust law enforcement because law enforcement are thinking, oh, just a bunch of prostitutes. So we would just take them down to the station, we'll go through the rigmarole of doing this, that, and the other. If the girl does not then say, oh, I'm trafficked and I know the name and I'll testify, then we're not interested. So you're just an illegal. So there's all those different factors that have to be wound into it. So law enforcement won't work like that. What we found was that if you were able to take them out of the bar, and the only way you could do it was to close it, raids of themselves don't work. The traffickers aren't sitting there waiting for you to get raided, to get bored. They're not going to do that. So it's got to be much more intelligence-based. You don't want the victim of trafficking to be your only witness, your only evidence. You don't want that. You've got to be an intelligent police officer and do your corroborative investigation. So you've got all your emphasis, you know exactly what's happened, who's moved, whom, where, what the outcome is. And if the woman does choose to testify, excellent. If she doesn't, you don't need it anyway. You get to close the bar. If you close the bar, you take the women out. They have to go. And this is what we did in Bosnia. Taken straight to a shelter where they aren't asked any questions at all, save for their names. If they want to give the name, the right name, doesn't matter. There they get healthcare, counselling, legal advice, and they can stay. And in Bosnia, we managed to keep it for like 3 weeks. And then law enforcement could come and, with only if the shelter manager said, could come and then talk to her in the shelter and with the shelter manager. And then she would then be allowed to have a visa to remain there, so her status was regulated, so she didn't have to worry about deportation while she had time to get whatever assistance she needed. And from then, we would find that we were getting tremendous information from them.
About the trafficking
about
ring,
the trafficking ring,
networks.
about the routes, about how it worked, about what really happened to them, what they wanted, what their aspirations were. And many of them wanted to, actually then having been forced into prostitution, they said, well, I've got to go home at some point. I need to go back with dignity. If I go to that bar, I know he'll pay me. And so if I work there and earn $2,000, I'm back. So not for me to say, no, you can't, no, you can't. You know, basically they knew where we knew where they were, and if they were going to do that and then they could go home on their own, then that's fine.
Three questions. How do we educate the community? What do we do about aggressive military masculinity? And what can US citizens do to pressure the UN to do a better job?
Okay, on the how do you get the message across, I think we have to talk to people like Laryssa, who makes films. Because, you know, to be absolutely honest, we've all been blathering on trying to get the message across for so many years, and I think people get bored with it, to be absolutely honest, because it's too big. It's too big to actually hold in your head. You see one film, and it hits you. You see a trafficked person, you see what happens to them in your community, and it traumatizes you because you can understand it. But when it's so big and so amorphous and so ostensibly complicated, and you're getting fed messages about prostitution and illegal migrants all the time, it's very easy to turn around and walk away and say it's too big. So what we do about that is, I think, extraordinarily difficult, and that's where I think we do need the creative, media-savvy people to be able to get that message across. So I'm not the best person at all to answer the media-savvy questions. But I do think it's important in that how you do it is related also to the second question on the masculinities issue. It's not that complicated. The one thing about the military is that it is supposedly a disciplined force. And I've met some of the guys from the Nordic battalions who have taken this issue very, very seriously and who have said it's all about leadership. And what they've done is they've instilled in their men, and you know, they've said they're big guys and they're good looking and they're charismatic, so they are the alpha male that all the other guys want to follow. And they've said absolutely no, under no conditions ever will a man have sex with a woman against her will. And if you're wearing this uniform and you do it, and you disgrace this uniform, and you have no idea what an amazing effect that has.
So that's using national pride.
National
as
pride
a mechanism.
and saying that a real man doesn't do this. A real man has no role in raping women. And it does, and you lead by example, and it works. I mean, I can't say it works 100%, but they have said that it works. And if you have that culture, and it gradually becomes something which is the norm within militaries, because I think there is another element to it. I think you've only seen the British military had a very, very strict code of conduct on rape. That if in the Second World War, if First World War, you were found guilty of rape, you'll be executed immediately. Boom. And surprisingly enough, it worked. But it was the British with the Nepalese soldiers in Kenya who were responsible for the rape of the Kenyan tribeswomen in the north. Massive rape. Why? Because they were given permission to go off and do what they like, because nobody thought that these tribeswomen were ever going to report on anything. So it just shows control can be actually meted. I'm not saying with the barrel of a gun, but it is something which can be actually linked to the integrity of the mission, the integrity of the individual, and that comes from putting that message across. And I think that really is a way of doing it. In terms of what the US citizens can do, it is this thing about extraterritorial jurisdiction and about the state hiring private companies to run their wars for them. Because that is effectively what's happening, basically, it's what's really terrifying is it's not just DynCorp, who makes $9 billion a year from the various contracts it's got with the United States, with the State Department. It's a proliferation of all sorts of other companies now. Afghanistan is replete with them, without any real regulation. Because they come under the status of forces agreements, they get their diplomatic immunities as well. I mean, for me, they're mercenaries. So they shouldn't even have the Geneva Conventions applied to them. But, you know, they walk away with it. They have now, some of them, DynCorp, they've shifted their headquarters to, where is it? One of the Arab states, I forget which one, which means extraordinarily difficult to get them as under American law. Now, how clever is that? It's going to be very complicated, so no one's going to bother. The other thing, apart from the obvious, is that they make their money out of war, and they pay your senators as lobbyists. So basically, where's that going? You can see, which is really, really frightening. So I think you, as American citizens, need to be absolutely on the ball with this subcontracting of American defense and prosecution of foreign policy to private companies, the privatization of war. And also then to push for the passage of this bill on extraterritorial jurisdiction, so you get some sort of legal control over what it is that your guys do, not even your guys, I mean Argentinians employed by American companies based out of Bahrain or wherever, but doing at the behest of the State Department is madness. I mean, talk about the market gone mad.
And something about the legislation, the extraterritorial legislation, Madeleine, is this just a US
There's a bill
and
in
have other
the US
countries got the same thing?
Right now, all the members of the Council of Europe are now fixed with it because the UK lost a case over Iraq, where Iraqis sued the UK and won eventually, because British soldiers had been complicit in the disappearance and murder and ill treatment of several Iraqis. There's one particular case, the Al-Skaini case. And basically the European court said, enough. Let's even forget the jurisprudence we've got today. This is a different world order. We now have troops in God knows how many different countries, and it cannot be that you can go to somebody else's country and commit a crime in that country for which you would be punished in your own country, and therefore there to be no consequence. So we have to rethink it. So now they're saying that states take their extraterritorial jurisdiction with them, so that the United Kingdom, in this case, was absolutely responsible for full investigation, transparent prosecution of those who are involved, and if not, they've committed a human rights violation. That now binds all the member states of the Council of Europe, which is excellent. And because that's happened there, that means that whenever there's a report now to the Human Rights Treaty body under the ICCPR, they will have to.
So that's 47 members of the Council of Europe, not just the European Union.
It, including the Russians. Stuck with it.
Yep.
So basically, and you can't have just Europe stuck with it, and not America, not Africa, and not Latin America. So that has to now go into the international system, and that now should be something we would really be pushing for, because not only is it legally correct, it makes sense, but as a matter of absolute morality, it's the only thing that makes sense. You can't go to somebody else's country and commit crimes that you would not be convicted of, that you would be convicted of in your home country.
So that we're left with a ringing injunction. We know what we need to do here in the United States. We now know what we need to press the United Nations to do abroad. And we have a very clear picture of how we need to work on the issue of gender, more fundamentally. Let me be the first to thank you, Madeleine. I have great admiration for your work. I know it is work that you've been chipping away at for at least 12 years.
Banging your head against a brick wall is what it is.
No, that would imply that it hadn't had any effect. It's had huge effect. We look forward here at Stanford in continuing our relationship with you. Thank you for all of your work. We're full of admiration.
So if you wanted to serve, you either had to resign as a police officer with no guarantee you'd get a job back, so it's taking a bit of a risk, or you had to be a retired police officer, or you had to be someone who, as in the case of Dennis Ledusa, had committed offences and was actually being processed in Orange County for the crimes he committed. So he wanted quickly to nip out and come over to Bosnia, became the deputy commander, can you believe it? And you can even recruit, because the UN doesn't scrutinise, there were supermarket security guards. And they're over there to actually police the local police into how to be good police. So the quality wasn't there. Absolutely wasn't there. I mean, Kathryn Bolkovac was someone who was very, very Afghanistan. They're starting, although we'll see if that happens. And one of the reasons they can do that is because of the legal changes which have happened in relation to the European court cases, that the European countries, because of a particular case which allows now for extraterritorial jurisdiction for human rights violations, which is fabulous. Because now you've got to behave, even if you've got immunity, you've got to behave. But going back to what I was saying, that means there are no controls, not necessarily good people, not necessarily well-trained people, no discipline, and then you have the peer group pressure. I got very friendly with a Pakistani officer in the police, and he said when he was picked up from the plane by his contingent, before you have any sort of way in which that conduct can be regulated by the domicile population, and you have a situation where you've all got some form of diplomatic immunity under the status of forces agreements. That means with your private contractor or your UN or diplomat. So basically, 24 hours a day, you are protected against whatever you might do. So even if you commit a crime which is as horrific as the crimes were being committed, if the local police, for whatever reason, did pick you up, and at the later stage they were picking people up, within seconds, your contingent commander was down, getting you out and saying you have immunity. And unless that contingent commander was serious about doing trafficking and therefore put you on the list and sent you home and had you prosecuted, which never happened.
Not ever?
Not ever.
There's been two recent prosecutions.
Now, yes, now they have. It's a good cop, and she was absolutely appalled by the quality of her co-people. They didn't even have regular uniforms. So wear something blue pants, blue shirt, doesn't matter what exactly it is. She was appalled by that. And then you have the other contingents who are provided for by the states. And some of those states are quite good, and some of the states are not so good. And there were certain contingents where there are regularly problems as to the levels of corruption and involvement in just this sort of activity. So that's the scene, that's the scenario. And part of the problem is that they're not screened by the UN before they go in. There's no vetting process, so we can get anybody. Then you arrive in a country which doesn't have any of this rule of law, doesn't have. The main protagonists in this were the employees of the company DynCorp, and the United States, because it got so many different police forces, I don't begin to understand. You cannot be a serving police officer and work for the UN if you're an American. You have to go through the contract, the private contract, which for the United States is DynCorp. So they have a contract to provide the police in this context, and some of the support staff, the logistical people, etc. So they were the ones who were providing the contingents for Bosnia, the American contingent. Now they don't, because you can't be a serving police officer, they need to attract people.